Ladies and gentlemen, guilt is heavy, not in the dramatic way that heartbreak or betrayal can feel like a crashing wave, but more like a slow, quiet weight pressing on your chest. It doesn't roar, it whispers, it shows up in the middle of the night when you're replaying that final conversation or lack of one. It lingers in your inbox when you scroll past their name. Guilt is not always loud, but it's persistent. It makes you question if doing what's best for you means you're a bad person. The first step in healing from this kind of guilt is to name it. We often rush past that part. We try to outthink it, justify it, spiritualize it, or ignore it altogether. But if we don't pause and say, this is guilt, and it's here for a reason, it just builds in the background. Naming the emotion brings it out of the shadows and into the light. It gives you agency. And agency is where healing begins. But here's where it gets tricky. Guilt often disguises itself as shame. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. So when we cut someone off, even for very valid, necessary, life-saving reasons, we can still internalize it as we are bad for doing it. That's not just painful, it's dangerous. It keeps us stuck in cycles where we abandon ourselves to avoid abandoning others. And that's not love, that's self-erasure. Sometimes the guilt you're carrying isn't even yours to hold. Maybe you were raised to believe that love means endurance, that family means forever, that friendship means loyalty, no matter how much it costs you. If you've been taught that leaving someone behind makes you cold or cruel, then guilt is a natural outcome of breaking that unspoken contract. But here's the truth. Sometimes walking away is love. Sometimes distance is dignity. And choosing yourself is not a betrayal, it's a reclamation. It's okay to feel guilty. You're not weak for feeling it. You're human. That guilt, it probably means you have empathy, that your heart is wired to care deeply about people, even the ones who hurt you. So don't rush to get rid of the guilt. Instead, sit with it. Ask it what it wants you to know. Often guilt is just trying to protect your sense of integrity. It wants to remind you that you're someone who tries to do the right thing. That's not a flaw, that's your compass. You just need to recalibrate it to include you in the circle of compassion. Naming guilt also helps you separate it from regret. Regret is when we wish we had done things differently. Guilt is when we believe we shouldn't have done them at all. You can regret how something ended while still knowing that ending it was the right call. That nuance is powerful. It allows you to hold compassion for your past self, who did the best they could with the awareness they had at the time. There's also cultural and generational baggage around guilt. Maybe you come from a family or a background where loyalty and silence were prized more than truth and well-being. Maybe emotional boundaries were seen as weakness or emotional neglect was normalized. If that's the water you were swimming in, it makes sense that guilt feels like drowning now. But you're allowed to swim toward the shore. You're allowed to unlearn what kept you in relationships that cost you your peace. In the end, naming the emotion doesn't erase it, but it softens it. It opens the door for compassion. And when you can meet your guilt with gentleness instead of judgment, it begins to loosen its grip. You start to see that cutting someone off wasn't about cruelty. It was about survival, healing, or finally choosing to live in alignment with your truth. And that is not something to feel guilty for. That is something to feel proud of. We are often taught to equate love with self-sacrifice, that being a good person means being endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly patient. So when we finally draw a boundary, when we say, this is the line I will not allow to be crossed again, it can feel like a betrayal. Not just to the other person, but to the version of ourselves we've been performing all our lives. The version who says yes when we want to say no, who absorbs discomfort to keep the peace. who smiles while quietly falling apart. But here's the truth. Boundaries are not walls. They're not punishments. They are declarations of where love for others meets love for yourself. A boundary says, I matter too. It says, I can love you and still choose not to let you hurt me. And the people who truly care for you, who see your full humanity, won't be threatened by that. They will honor it. Because healthy relationships are not built on guilt and obligation. They are built on respect and mutual safety. Still, the internal conflict is real, especially if you've been someone's emotional caretaker, especially if you've been conditioned to keep the peace, hold the family together, or be the bigger person. That role gets so wrapped up in your identity that stepping out of it feels selfish. But it's not, it's sacred. It means you're finally recognizing that your well-being isn't something to be negotiated for someone else's comfort. It means you're beginning to see your emotional safety as non-negotiable. Let's be honest, when someone benefits from your lack of boundaries, they will almost always frame your limits as cruelty. They'll say you're cold, selfish, heartless. But that's not a reflection of your character. It's a reflection of how deeply they were invested in your silence. They weren't asking for love. They were asking for access. And when you close that door, it's not betrayal, it's clarity. And clarity is freedom. One of the hardest things about setting boundaries is that you don't just lose the toxic connection. You often lose the fantasy, the hope that maybe this time it will change. Maybe they'll listen. Maybe they'll finally see how much it's cost you to stay. Boundaries force us to accept the painful truth that some people are more in love with the version of us who never says no than the real us who finally does. And grieving that fantasy is part of the process. But boundaries are not about changing other people. They're about choosing you. Every time you enforce one, you are sending a message to your nervous system. I will protect you. I will not abandon you again. And that, more than anything, is how self-trust is rebuilt. Choice by choice, line by line. You begin to anchor yourself in a new kind of safety. Not the safety of being liked, but the safety of being true. Sometimes people won't understand, and that's okay. You don't need their permission to protect your peace. Your worth is not dependent on how well others receive your boundaries. You are allowed to be the villain in someone else's story if it means being the hero in your own. Let them misunderstand. Let them talk. What matters most is that you know the difference between being kind and being compliant, between compassion and codependency, between connection and self-abandonment. In the end, boundaries are not the end of love. They are the beginning of real love, love that is honest, love that is mutual, love that has room for you to breathe and be. So if you're feeling guilt for choosing that pause, breathe. Remember that saying no to what hurts you is the deepest yes to your healing. And that's not betrayal, that's bravery. There's a kind of grief that doesn't come with funerals or condolences. It doesn't have a name people speak aloud. It happens quietly in the spaces where expectations lived. It's the grief of letting go of a relationship, not just the person, but the hope, the potential, the dream of what it could have been. And this grief is complicated because you're not just saying goodbye to what was, you're mourning what never was and maybe never could be. We don't always give ourselves permission to grieve in these moments, especially when we were the ones who ended it. The world says, you chose to walk away. Shouldn't that make it easier? But grief doesn't care who made the decision. It only knows that something has ended. Something your heart once believed in. And it's okay, even necessary, to mourn that, to sit with the ache of all the unspoken words, the unmet needs, the apologies that never came. You might grieve the person they were in the beginning, or the person you became when you were with them. You might miss the late night talks, the inside jokes, the little routines that felt like home. And still, you can know deep in your bones that it had to end. That doesn't make the grief less valid. It makes it more human. We are allowed to be heartbroken over what hurt us. We are allowed to miss what we had to walk away from. One of the most painful parts is realizing that you were never grieving a relationship as it was. You were grieving it as you hoped it would become. That version you held on to in your mind, the one where they finally saw you, heard you, showed up for you, that future you painted in quiet daydreams where things healed and you both grew and it finally felt safe. When you say goodbye, you're not just letting go of them, you're letting go of that version of your story. And that grief can be disorienting because there's no ceremony for it, no ritual to mark the moment. You just wake up one day and realize it's really over, that your silence is permanent now, that the door is closed. And maybe you second guess it. Maybe you reach for your phone. Maybe you wonder if you overreacted. That's normal because closure is rarely a clean break. It's 1,000 little releases over and over again until the grief starts to soften. Be gentle with yourself here. Don't rush to move on or tie it up with a life lesson. Grief doesn't respond to logic. It doesn't care how long it's been or how toxic the relationship was. It just asks to be felt. And when you feel it, not fix it, not analyze it, but feel it, you create space for something beautiful. Acceptance. Not the kind of acceptance that says what happened was okay, but the kind that says it happened and I survived it. Letting go of a relationship you hoped for is one of the bravest things you can do. It means you chose reality over fantasy. It means you stopped waiting for someone to become who you needed and started becoming that for yourself. That's not weakness. That's growth. That's the kind of heartbreak that transforms you not into someone hardened or bitter, but into someone more whole, more awake, more honest. So if you're grieving right now, let yourself. Cry if you need to. Write the letter you'll never send. Light the candle. Sit in the quiet. You're not being dramatic. You're not being soft. You're being real. And in a world that tells us to move on quickly and feel less, that kind of honesty is revolutionary. Mourn the goodbye, grieve the hope, and know this: healing isn't about forgetting the relationship, it's about finally remembering yourself. One of the reasons guilt lingers so deeply after cutting someone off is because we confuse shame with accountability. It's subtle but powerful. Accountability says, I take ownership for my choices. Shame says, because of my choices, I am unworthy. And that confusion can keep us trapped, feeling like we must punish ourselves in order to prove we were justified, as if our pain must be validated by our ongoing suffering. But here's the truth. Accountability is rooted in integrity. Shame is rooted in fear. When we hold ourselves accountable, we are recognizing the complexity of being human. We can say, I made the best decision I could with what I knew at the time. That's not evading responsibility, that's honoring your growth. Shame, on the other hand, leaves no room for growth. It paints the whole picture with one brushstroke. You are bad. You are broken. And when we live from that place, it's nearly impossible to heal. Cutting someone off doesn't automatically make you the villain, but shame will try to convince you it does. It will whisper, if you were kinder, more forgiving, more patient, they would have changed. It will tell you that choosing peace is selfish, that choosing space means you gave up. Shame distorts the truth until you can no longer see your own self-preservation as an act of courage. And that's when we start turning our pain inward, thinking that if we just hurt ourselves enough emotionally, it might justify the choice we made. This is where accountability becomes your anchor. You can say, yes, I walked away. Yes, it hurt them. Yes, it hurt me too. And yes, it was necessary. You can acknowledge that you're not perfect, that you could have handled things with more grace or clarity, and still stand by your decision to leave. That's what accountability sounds like. It doesn't excuse harm, but it doesn't demand perfection either. It invites truth without demanding shame as payment. One of the most healing realizations is that accountability actually moves us toward healing, while shame keeps us stuck in cycles of self judgment. When you're accountable, you get to reclaim your power. You get to ask, what have I learned? Instead of, what did I destroy? You get to grow. You get to become someone who honors their boundaries with both firmness and compassion. And that's what healing really looks like. Not perfection, but responsibility wrapped in self love. You may also find that others project their own shame onto you. They might say things like, you didn't even try, or you just gave up on them. But that's not your shame to carry. People often respond to your boundaries with resistance because your truth makes them uncomfortable. It shines a light on places in their own lives where they have stayed silent or small. Don't shrink yourself to protect others from doing their own work. Shame can also disguise itself as humility. It says, I shouldn't talk about how hard this was because they had it worse. Or who am I to cut someone off when I've made mistakes too? But boundaries are not a competition of who has suffered more. They are about emotional safety. You are allowed to protect your peace, even if you've hurt people before. You are allowed to say enough, even if you once allowed too much. Accountability holds space for your humanity. Shame demands your silence. So when the shame creeps in, when it tells you that you are unworthy of compassion or clarity or healing, pause, breathe, remind yourself, I can hold myself accountable without hating myself. I can honor my decision without justifying it to anyone. I can feel grief without believing I'm a bad person. That's not denial, that's truth. And truth is what sets us free. Choosing peace over pleasing is one of the hardest emotional decisions you will ever make because it means breaking a pattern that likely kept you feeling safe for years. People pleasing often begins as survival. For some of us, it started in childhood. Keeping everyone happy was how we avoided conflict, rejection, punishment, or emotional abandonment. We learned that our needs were secondary, that being loved meant being useful, agreeable, so when we finally say no, when we stop performing and start protecting our peace, it can feel like rebellion. It can feel like loss, but it's not rebellion. It's reclamation. It's taking back your right to exist without having to earn your worth through compliance. Choosing peace means choosing discomfort in the short term, awkward silences, disapproval, maybe even backlash, so that you can live with more alignment, more ease, and more truth in the long term. And yes, that's courageous because it's not just about changing your behavior. It's about rewiring your entire emotional blueprint. People pleasing isn't about kindness, it's about fear. The fear of being disliked, disappointing someone, or being seen as selfish. But peace doesn't come from being liked. Peace comes from being real. When you prioritize your inner calm over someone else's opinion of you, you're not being unkind, you're being honest. And sometimes honesty will disappoint people, but it will always liberate you. The thing about peace is that it doesn't always feel peaceful at first. When you're used to living in anxiety, silence can feel like abandonment. When you're used to tiptoeing around other people's emotions, stillness can feel like guilt. That's the withdrawal. That's the unraveling of an identity that was built around over-functioning, over-giving, and over-apologizing. You are not broken for feeling uneasy in your peace. You are healing. Choosing peace also means accepting that not everyone will understand. People who benefited from your self-sacrifice may call you selfish. People who relied on your emotional labor may call you cold. That's not a reflection of your integrity. It's a reflection of their expectations, and expectations are not your responsibility. You are allowed to grow beyond the role people assign to you. You are allowed to disappoint others without dismantling yourself. Sometimes choosing peace means letting go of people who only loved you for how little you asked of them. That truth stings, but in its clarity, there's freedom. Because once you stop trying to earn love through performance, you create space for relationships where love is given freely, without conditions, without scripts, without shrinking. The kind of love that begins with you and extends outward, not the other way around. You will likely lose some connections when you choose peace. That's the grief part. But what you gain is worth so much more. You gain time, you gain energy, you gain clarity. Most importantly, you gain yourself. And when you are at peace with yourself, you stop outsourcing your self-worth to people's reactions. You begin to trust your gut, to take up space, to speak with less apology and more intention. That is what true empowerment looks like. Not loud, not flashy, just steady and grounded. So if you've chosen peace recently, if you've walked away, stayed silent, said no, or drawn a line in the sand, please hear this. You are not weak. You are not mean. You are not cold. You are courageous. And your courage will become your compass. Let it guide you. Let it soften you too. Because peace is not about hardening your heart. It's about returning to it.